Okay, I have actually two questions. They're both for, I guess, Kathleen Morrison. And the first one is actually, I'm asking out of ignorance, so please forgive me. But I'm thinking about hydroelectricity. How significant is hydropower as a source of power in South Asia? And is it inefficient in delivering electricity? Is this why there's always that phenomenon of load shedding where you never know when they're going to just kill the power in the middle of the day? And if you're not lucky enough to have a generator in your home, you're just out of luck until they decide to turn the power back on. Is it an inefficiency in delivering the electricity because it's derived by water? Like, what's going on there? That load shedding is this thing, and why not pursue wind power or solar power? My understanding is that oil and natural gas is just not readily available as a natural resource in South Asia, so why not pursue these other sources of energy? So that's one question. My other question is about your argument about the cultural logic of the dam, which I thought was very interesting, that a good king provides irrigation for his subjects. How does that concept or that argument, how does this stand up to the idea or to the mass protests against the dam, right? If the good king is supposed to provide irrigation, but there are always going to be ousties, then what defines good kingship or what defines legitimate rule? And the reason I'm asking that is because I'm wondering if it's actually about mastering science and technology, even if we're talking about the Middle Ages, even if we're talking about the 10th century. Is a good king one who can master science and technology? And if so, then doesn't that connect this argument more closely to the anti-colonial aspect, where one of the ideologies of British rule was that we're here because India is inferior and different, and one of the ways in which it's inferior is because of this lack of technological progress.
Okay, I think, is this on? Can you hear me? So let's go in order. First of all, I don't think load shedding, which is just a very charming term for a power cut, basically, right, it can't be laid at the feet of hydroelectric, right? India just has, inadequate energy to meet the needs of its population, basically. Also, there are serious infrastructure problems with delivering energy to all of the consumers in India. That's not the fault of hydro in any way, right? Hydroelectric power, and I don't have the facts and figure, it is actually very modest. It contributes a modest amount to India's overall power use. And there are efforts to expand renewable sources of power. There are tremendous construction of windmills and solar and various other kinds of things. So it's not as though that isn't happening. And of course, as we should always do, as we saw in the presentation on China, the per capita energy consumption of Indians in general is minute, but there are many Indians also, right? So it does add up, but by and large, most Indian people, use very small amount of power. So it's a complex situation, and it's complicated by the fact that you need foreign exchange in order to get oil and gas on an international market. And particularly before the Indian economy was liberalized in the 1980s, foreign exchange was a very scarce commodity indeed. So the idea of self-sufficiency in power, as in other kinds of forms of production, was very much an ethos of the government planning process for all of India's economy from the time of independence up until the 1980s, the so-called economic liberalization era, when India began to enter the world economy in a different way. And arguably, it made India a much stronger, it was not a period of great economic growth, that period. On the other hand, India entered into the world economy in a position of much greater strength than it may have had otherwise, right? So, we all know that India and China are, sort of the great economic success stories right now. But it still, there's tremendous inequality and so on. The second question is about the notion of the cultural logics. And I posted an article that I published as one of the resources that Jamie asked me to send some links and documents. And that goes into the argument in much greater detail. Here I just barely touched on it because I realized I had started out with the temples of modern India quote, and I'd better finish up with the temples of modern India quote, or the talk doesn't make any sense at all, right? And I think that for the most part, the idea of a kind of, just rule and the provision of irrigation systems by kings and so on, this is particularly talking about, middle period or medieval South India, and particularly in terms of Hindu texts and things. It's not that kings need to master science and technology. That's not the issue at all. But I think that then, as always, not all people are created equal. So what kind of water is being provided, what forms of irrigation are being provided is very much at issue. So what we see, and this is like a whole other topic, you shouldn't get me started on this because this is kind of the core of my own research, is the ways in which agricultural production and food consumption have changed in Indian history. So what you see now, even in the dry parts of southern India, is that rice, which is a very water-intensive, labor-intensive crop, is the core of food for the rich, right? So it's the formation of an elite cuisine. So if you go to Udupi Palace on Devon and have some nice South Indian food, it will all be rice-based, and it will be very wet, almost like a rice patty, you might say, right? So there's a kind of development of an elite cuisine that happens historically sometime around the first millennium AD or so. That's what I'm working on right now. However, most people in the dry parts of South India don't eat rice on a daily basis. They eat sorghum and other millets, right? These are very hardy, dry grains that can be produced with rain-fed agriculture, not with irrigation, really. And so there's a huge gap between who's growing what, who's eating what, and who's provided with irrigation. That's not dissimilar. I mean, that's still the case, really. All the things change when you start to get railroads and trucks and so on, and food moves around. But in many ways, and of course the 16th century is not the same as the 21st century. I'm not saying it is. But there are kind of amazing cultural resonances that go on. And things just get, added on to. So the kind of notion about progress and science and technology, that's very much part of the modernist project that comes with the 20th century. And there's no question about that, right? But I think that there is, even for Nehru, a kind of an echo. I mean, Nehru knew his history, really. There's a kind of sense of how a ruler behaves, what this kind of and he's from Kashmir, way up in the north. He's not reading, thinking I need to be a South Indian king, right? There's a kind of sense of the responsibilities of a ruler, and building of a reservoir in a lot of these older texts is one of the sort of 7 most exemplary deeds a person can do in your life, and those are things like building a temple, having a son, finding buried treasure, that's my favorite, building a reservoir, writing a literary work, and so on. These are the things which are sometimes referred to as the 7-fold progeny, the things that will live on after you, right? Of course, they're only for men, and you notice that they don't actually have the sons or build the reservoirs. So there's a kind of, there's a power dimension even in that, you might say. So who counts? Okay, so the last thing was, about technological progress and so on. And I think that in terms of the kind of anti-colonial dimension, of course it's textiles that are the most potent symbol of the way in which British colonial power undermined Indian industry. I mean, because, and there's a lot of legitimate pride in the state of, sort of pre-British, indigenous science and technology in South Asia. And there's no question that, India was the world producer of textiles in the old world, prior to the colonization, as early as maybe the 2nd or 3rd century AD, right? So they were producing all these kinds of amazing textiles, trading them all around the world, and there's no question that industry was basically dismantled by the British. So the idea that, we Indians can, build great dams, look at this fantastic thing, we can have factories, we can produce everything we need, from cars to, paper clips, that's a very, powerful kind of impulse, right? And, one has a certain, I do have a certain sympathy with that. On the other hand, it hasn't always worked out, for the best, I would say, for the bulk of the population.
Another question?
Two summers ago, I spent a lot of time reading biographies of FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, and one after the other. And when you read those, there's some of the same idea about what dams could bring to a country. And I remember reading about Eleanor and thinking that it's like creating something out of nothing, creating wealth, a water supply, an electrical supply, jobs, all sorts of things that, almost like, why didn't anyone think of this before? We can bring things to people, say people in the Appalachians, the TVA project. And I'm wondering, is there any connection between that? Is it the technology that is developed, or does Nehru get some? Is he think of what FDR has done in these huge projects in the U.S. and maybe, and I don't know if they're happening other places in the world, but it's almost as though it's one of the strategies to get out of the depression. Let's create these huge projects, and it reminded me of that when you talked about Nehru.
It was an international scene, right? So the first big dam project in India was in Bengal, and it was modeled precisely on the TVA. And Indian engineers went to Tennessee, TVA engineers came back, and I think I showed a picture actually on the Bakra Dam, and I probably was going too fast to mention, of one of the chief engineers, Harvey Slocum, who was an American engineer. So there was certainly, there's this international world of engineers who are building all of these kinds of dams, for sure. So it's not as though this was something that was, cooked up in Nehru's mind independently. It was definitely something that was going on all over the place. And, one thing that always really strikes me about dams in India, despite the fact of really significant protests, and I don't want to, underestimate that, because the power of these protest movement is really impressive, right? On the other hand, dams are huge tourist attractions as well. You go on any government-run tourism trip in the region where I work, where there's a UNESCO World Heritage archaeological site, it's fantastic. You always end up at the Tungabhadra Dam at the end, right? It's part of the attraction. But you know what? Like the Hoover Dam is a huge tourist attraction here too. And particularly for a certain generation, like my grandparents' generation, the Hoover Dam, they always wanted to take me to the Hoover Dam, actually. Because it was just like a marvel, a marvel of the modern world. And what's really been interesting is like this restudy of the Bakra Nangal project that I cited several things from, is that even some of the, what we're seeing as the real successes of it have turned out to not be always of very lasting value. So provision of water for irrigation, that's one of the top priorities there, and there's huge problems with water logging, salinization, and so on. So, in fact, even in the command area of the Bakra Dam, most irrigation is done now by bore wells and electric pumps, not from the canal water at all. Although, they are run by electricity, which is generated by the dam.
The phenomenon of other nations coming to learn from the U.S., certainly in India, also in Turkey in particular, and Kemal Ataturk, the first leader of modern Turkey, contemporary of Nehru, there was exchange between those two countries on dam building technology, and a lot of the students came to the U.S. and the engineers came here. If you look at the presidents and prime ministers of Turkey, there's a surprisingly high proportion of water engineers who became presidents and prime ministers of Turkey, and that just sort of drives the whole mentality of the country. Back to the question a couple seconds ago about hydropower and its role in energy grids and then renewables. Certainly in Turkey and in lots of other places, the power. Okay, dams and reservoirs, these big ones, tend to get built in places where nobody lives, or few people live in comparison to the dense urban populations where most of the energy is consumed. So certainly in Turkey, most of the energy that is produced in the southeast part of the country, which is not as densely populated, most of that energy is channeled off through the electric grid to eastern Turkey, western Turkey, to Istanbul and the other main cities there. And so the local population who sees all this electricity being produced doesn't get any of it, and there continue to be electricity shortages even at homes 2 feet away from the dams, which is strange in itself. That goes to the need for creation of electric grids, which is a problem here in our own country as we look to expand renewable energy production, particularly from wind and solar. Windy places or big open places with lots of sunshine are not where the electric grids are today. The electric grids tend to follow rivers and railroad lines because that's where people live. I mean, they're all sort of in the same place. It's the problem here, it's the problem in Turkey, it's the problem in lots of other places that want to expand renewable energy production. They first need an electric grid to hook those wind turbines up to. So,
I just want to add something on that too. Is just one of the things about hydropower is that because you have, for large projects, you have this reservoir that essentially acts as a battery, and when you talk to utilities, that can be extremely valuable for load balancing. So I know in the region where I come from, out in the Pacific Northwest, we're getting close to maxed out on what we can do with wind power, because when the wind dissipates, you have to find a way to balance that load, and hydropower can be incredibly effective at doing that. And one of the questions that I had on the materials that I put together here that I think leads to an interesting discussion on this topic as we think about different types of energy sources is on the section on energy production. I ask, how do different fuel sources for energy production relate to the operational and logistical requirements of managing an energy portfolio? So, what are the challenges of, you have a certain percentage in hydro, you have a certain percentage in wind energy, and if you want to increase one over the other, what does that mean in terms of being able to, develop a balanced portfolio on this stuff?
This is more like a comment because, first of all, I thank all the three panelists here for their excellent presentations. Born in India and raised in India, I just can't refrain from making some comments. Kathleen, excellent presentation. About Nehru, calling the Bhakranangal Dam as the temple that he would like to worship. There is a Sanskrit word, I'm sure you know this is called mandir, that is temple. And believe it or not, in Vedic literature, for a place to ease, it is called Avishkar Mandir. I mean, it's great connotation. Where you go to ease yourself in the morning is called a mandir also. Like that, even the temples of learning or schools are called mandirs. So being an Indian, perhaps he must have connotated, a synagogue is also as a temple, I understand. So it is not so much of not unsecular or anything like that. So that's, I think, in his own way of thinking, he said, hey, this is the ultimate for me. This is it. This is my temple. I'm going to pray for it for the welfare of the society. That's the way I think he interpreted that one. And the other comment is, you talked about dams, and recently there is a surge of interest in small dams, like check dams they're called. There are several places in India which are turned to be arid. They are now just blossoming because these little check dams in rural areas, some NGOs and some of my friends are doing tremendously good work. They're stopping the flow of the water and then in a nice way, in an engineeringly designed way, so that that water could be used for the local area to grow crops. And people in one village particularly, it's a classic tale, how water came back. And in this village, there are now lackeyers, they call them. They earn more than a lakh of rupees, 100,000 rupees. They come back instead of digging ditches in the cities. So there is a place for these little check dams in these villages that they're working at a very large scale. Third, a comment about load shutdown you mentioned. That's a word that is commonly used in India. And there are reasons for that. Because you see, in government, many states, as you know, the government has given free electricity to the farmers. So when something is free, you know what you do with it. There is an exuberance of spending that. And also, there is thievery. People steal power. And this is a corruption. And also, there are transmission losses more than 30%. I mean, some rates up to 50, 60% in certain areas. So there are all the causes for load shutdown, not so much about the technology involved in, because this can be corrected by proper maintenance and operations. By the way, in Westmont, there's a better restaurant than Udupi and Diwan. You can try the food there in Westmont, the Sri restaurant. But besides my masala dosa, my wife makes, that's the best one.
Which one is that? Sorry?
That is Sri restaurant.
Ah, I haven't tried that.
In Westmont. Thank you.
So the small dams are interesting as we sit here in a room full of rain barrels, which are in many ways a similar mentality. And tomorrow we'll talk about green infrastructure a little bit for stormwater management. These are all small dams, rain barrels, whatever, and renewable energy production are all ways to decentralize a lot of these large infrastructure systems that we depend on. If you can have a rain barrel in your backyard, you're not as dependent on a central management system for water. If you can have a small dam in your village that your village controls, then you're not as dependent on the central government system. This is, even here in the Chicago region, these rain barrels are perceived as a very uncertain, the cynic would say threat, the optimist would say challenge, to the way we handle wastewater and stormwater here in the region. So this idea of decentralizing systems is certainly not exclusive to the developing world. We have it here too, and we can talk about it more tomorrow. Sorry, the rain barrels made me think of it as you were talking about it.
One other comment I want to make about Maharajas. Actually, he gets the orders from the Maharani the previous night. So she controls everything. So women, every successful person has a successful one behind him.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for your presentations. They were just amazing and very thought-provoking. I wanted to ask about the diversion of water from the Yangtze north and what you thought were the costs and benefits of that. I just learned about it yesterday, so it was brought up. Has it started, and what do you perceive to be the costs and benefits?
Yeah, so they have started this this water diversion to the north, first with the eastern route, and then the Three Gorges Reservoir is actually in part a storage reservoir for the central diversion project to the north. In terms of the cost of this project, it's a massive water transfer system, and I think one of the things that I look at when I think about just how things are evolving there is thinking back to our own country and what's been done in California with our own massive water diversion projects, and have had some significant societal benefits in terms of agricultural production and diversity of food sources. But they come, if you look at those rivers in California and the way the whole system's been plumbed, it comes at a tremendous cost to natural river systems, the biota that depend on those, and so I don't think I have an easy answer for this, but I think it is informative to look at some of the history in our own country of where these things have been done.
Not even as far away as California.
Well, yeah.
We 110 years ago diverted the Great Lakes into the Mississippi River right here in Chicago, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. Just remember that every problem starts as a solution, right? And so we need to talk about the context in which those decisions get made and the lack perhaps of foresight. Of course, in hindsight, it looks like lack of foresight, but why those decisions are made at the time and how to improve and make the decision-making process a little more holistic and long-term thinking and inclusive. So, come back tomorrow.
I have many, but I'll hold it to a couple. One, you mentioned that the Three Gorges was trying to meet all four goals, and it's very rare that a dam system and reservoir system would try to do all four of, navigation, hydropower, irrigation, and what was the fourth one?
Water storage.
What? Yeah, let's see. Flood
yes.
control.
And now you're even talking about major diversion as
yes.
well. How do you really? Is it proving to be able to do all of those things or not?
They are having, they have been, operating the project and been, successful in meeting several of those needs. It's a question of trade-offs, because for you to produce hydropower, you need to have as much head as possible. So you want the reservoir as high as possible. When the reservoir is low, you have less head. your hydropower production efficiency is much lower. So, but during the spring, the late spring flood pulse, you want to keep the reservoir low so you can capture that flood pulse. So, yes, you're able to do these different things, but, just illustrating with that example, that's, one way that you do have to make some trade-offs in these different things. And that's why, a lot of facilities are often constructed to, optimize one thing, and maybe two, but this one they've attempted to really do all four of those things.
Another question that I had is that I was struck by how in the Tigris and Euphrates in Turkey and also in the Yangtze River and also in India, these dams are being built in very active tectonic zones. I think, if they model it on the TVA, which was built in Tennessee, or the Mississippi River, those earlier projects, those were not in areas like that. And I didn't hear much from any of you about the risks of building in those areas. Is it seen as a problem?
Yeah, well, I'll say something to that about the example in China. I showed that, spoke somewhat to the geology of the region, and the fact that, not only that Three Gorges project, but they're looking at several projects in a very geologically active region. And one of the things that, I think is worth considering is the fact that these dams do have a finite lifespan, and, whether that's, just through, gradual filling in or whatever through a catastrophic event, it is something that, should be considered. It comes down to a probability question too. What's the probability that that's going to, happen in the time span of, the folks who are immediate involved in the construction and design of this thing. But, it's certainly one of the, long-term concerns that's been raised about that project and other projects in that region.
There has been some concern raised also, about not simply putting dams in tectonically active zone, but the sort of micro effect of the dam itself, because of course it's very heavy, right, all that water. So that's something that's been very much at issue in some of the protests in South Asia, but as far as I can tell, has otherwise not been, much discussed.
If a dam in the Tigris and Euphrates broke and all that water rushed out, it would go into Syria and Iraq, not into Turkey, and that affects some of the planning or lack of it for those issues in that particular context of different countries on the watershed.
Other questions?
Two questions. One sort of getting to Catherine's point. I understood as they were finally completing the locks on the Yangtze River, there was a considerable engineering question about whether that water could actually be held back, and they weren't sure those weren't going to break almost immediately. And that was reported on Discovery Channel. I don't hold it to be the most reliable reporter in the world, but I wondered about that and whether that was accurately reported. And then the other thing I had read is that environmentalists around the world were very concerned that because of the amount of water the Three Gorges Dam was backing up, it could in fact change climate around the world. And I wondered if we had any evidence of that at this point.
Boy, so I don't have direct knowledge of that, that last question, but just, backing up to the previous one, this is a concrete gravity dam, which basically means the mass of the dam holds back the water. Tremendously large reservoir that's behind that dam. There has been some localized issues with landslides and whatnot, but so far the evaluations that have been done that I've reviewed have suggested that the dam, is designed appropriately, for the situation, barring, what happens in the long term.
Mr. Ellis, I was curious about if you know anything about the U.S. military, pulling out of Iraq, and how much they have considered replenishing those marshes, or in their facilitation of, keeping Iraq united amongst the people there. How much has there been consideration in that fact for the watershed?
I don't know about the U.S. military, but USAID has been working very actively with the Iraqi Ministry of Agriculture on getting agriculture, not necessarily in the marshes, but in broader Iraq, closer to Baghdad, getting farms and canals and everything up and running again. The problem there is that as those farms produce more and more agricultural goods for export, which has actually been the Iraqi model of agricultural production since the 60s and 70s. They export cotton and wheat and rice and stuff to Europe and other places. They're doing more and more of that to get the economy back up and running. Well, that consumes water and also puts more fertilizers and salts and things in the river, which then show up in the marshes. So I don't think that the U.S., certainly not the military, but even the U.S. development organizations have been too active in trying to get more water into the marshes. There is a plan right now for the Iraqi government, the Ministry of Water Resources, to create 17 or 18 essentially valves at different choke points in the marshes, and the central government will control water levels in and out of the marshes through these valves. Valves not unlike some of the ones that Saddam Hussein was building to move water around in the region. So I don't really know if that answers your question, but yes and no. There's an effort to create a self-sustaining economy in Iraq, and that has effects further downstream. And then there's this effort to somewhat restore the marshes using these engineering solutions.
A question about the methodology of your own work and the availability of sources. Those of us who have done, historical research usually do it, of course, in print sources of various sorts, and its social, political, cultural history, etc. Ms. Morrison, especially, and all of you, I'm sure, do this. How do you get at what are some of the new techniques that you've had to learn with satellite imagery and other methods? What's the nature of some of the sources you're working with? And are any of those accessible to kids? If we want to work with primary sources.
The work that I've done, includes the kind of, traditional historical work with archives and documents. And of course, that always is available, right, for kids as well. But the other sort of unusual, dimension of the work that I've done is that it's archaeological. So we've done systematic archaeological surveys, which is basically walking around and documenting structures on the ground. And then I've also done studies of past vegetation by looking at pollen grains from stratified sediment context, mostly from the reservoirs themselves. So by taking these long sediment cores to reconstruct the past vegetation. And then also reconstructing erosional regimes by doing sedimentological kinds of studies in reservoirs and elsewhere as well. So we've done a lot of coring of reservoirs and looking at grain size analysis and things like that, because you can see, you can map the kind of pattern of how a reservoir fills in with silt, right? Because as fast-moving water carries larger particles, so there's typically a kind of a pattern where there's gravel and larger rocks around the outside, and then sand, and then silt right up against the dam itself. So we've mapped out those size distributions at different depths to look at how it's changed through time. We also do use satellite imagery, and for kids, I can, things obviously like Google Earth are so super easy to use. And in my field, I mean, even those of us, it's my grad students who do all the fancy satellite stuff. I'm not at all good at that. So I just use Google Earth myself, I mean, because it's quite simple. But there are, ways in which you can talk about, like, say, the environmental effects of holding back water and things like that, even with kids. I mean, so if you're an environmental science teacher, maybe things like particle sizes and water flows. I mean, that you can do that in a puddle, really. I mean, if you just start to look around and notice. And then, also I have a 7-year-old son, so I'm totally unqualified to talk about teaching, younger kids, except that I have a 7-year-old son. And, we visited a dam in California, and there's a hatchery there. So we went to see the hatchery and watch the fish on the fish ladders, And then we talked about, decommissioning dams and what about salmon moving upstream and, what are the rights of the salmon versus the rights of the people. And, even I like to think I have a smart 7-year-old, but I mean, even, someone of that age, he was really into those questions, and thought about it. And I think it was a significant thing. But I'm sure there's lots of things you can do with the satellite imagery in particular. And there are many public sources of satellite data, not just Google Earth, but there's lots and lots of publicly accessible sources.
Yeah, I just want to add something on that. As someone I've done some of this in my own research, is looking at, historical aerial imagery and, what that means for, a river system that's, once the dam's constructed. And, we saw several examples of that over the course of today of, historical analysis of aerial imagery that can be incredibly powerful for telling these stories. And I know when not so many years ago that I was in grad school, and you had to order these things or at very high cost, and just not only in terms of what Google Earth now has in terms of their current stuff, but they're also starting to provide more historical imagery. And there's some incredible resources that I think are available that weren't available when I was doing research on this stuff just like 5 years ago.
A lot of academic libraries have things like that too. University of Chicago has something called the Digital South Asia Library that has a lot of historic photos and things like that.
So, very locally, the best place to start with this water stuff is explaining how it works in our region and people's hometowns, wherever. For some of this aerial imagery stuff, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, for all of its problems with getting its budget cut and having to close state parks and stuff like that, actually does have a very good online resource of aerial imagery, historic aerial imagery for all of Illinois, and particularly the Chicago region. If you're going to start using Google Earth, and you can overlay shape files from different GIS databases, there's a big collaborative from Indiana through Illinois all the way up to Wisconsin called what's the website called? I'll tell you tomorrow what the website's called. That has all of the shape files you would need for rivers, aquifers, wetlands, parks, urban spaces, everything. You can download it all, and you can then lay those files right onto the basic Google Earth template and actually start playing with that stuff. So those resources are out there, and kids learn it really quick. You have somebody come in and talk about how to put shape files into Google Earth, and in 5 minutes they're going to be blowing you out of the water, right? Now, the project that I was doing in my master's degree was really a critical interpretation of the rhetoric that was driving decision making, because I looked at congressional records and testimonies, and there was no science or no environmental history being used to justify putting money into different projects in the Middle East in terms of water. It was all rhetoric from politically connected environmental groups sometimes, or politically connected elites or whatever. So mine was really an interpretation of what the stories were out in the media, and that's all available too. The problem is a lot of people will read the first story they come across, believe it, and go from there, as opposed to trying to connect the pieces and looking at the entire system. So I will make a point of tomorrow in my presentation about Chicago regional stuff, showing these websites, because I think we're on Wi-Fi here, so I can pull them right up and and we can do that at the end of the presentation tomorrow.
Great. Well, I think that's a great question to wrap up this afternoon's last session. I'd like to, again, thank all of our panelists for a wonderful discussion this afternoon.